Sometimes, the truth comes from the most unexpected places. Senator John Fetterman, the same man who once flipped a Republican seat, just called out his own party live on national television. No spin, no talking points, just raw honesty. He told Democrats to stop demonizing Trump supporters, stop using hate labels, and start acting like leaders again. Within hours, the headlines turned on him. His own colleagues began plotting against him. But that's not all. On that very same day, a Democrat judge in Chicago issued a ruling that stunned the nation, banning ICE agents from making arrests inside courthouses. 2 moments, one message. The cracks inside the Democratic Party aren't hidden anymore. They're splitting wide open. Let's break down what really happened and what it means for America's future. Currently, we're living through something fascinating. I don't mean fascinating in a good way necessarily, more like watching a bridge buckle under its own weight. The Democratic Party, for decades, has presented itself as the party of unity, tolerance, and inclusion. But what happens when someone inside that party stands up and says, "Wait a minute, we're not being tolerant at all. We're being hypocrites"? That's exactly what John Fetterman did. And the reaction? Swift, brutal, and telling. Let me take you back for a moment. Fetterman wasn't always the guy challenging his own team. Just a few years ago, he was a progressive darling. He won a Senate seat in Pennsylvania that had been Republican for over a decade. He wore hoodies and shorts to Congress. He looked different, talked different, and Democrats loved him for it. He was authentic, they said. A man of the people. Someone who could connect with working-class voters in the Rust Belt. The very voters Democrats had been losing to Republicans for years. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Maybe it was the stroke he suffered during his campaign. Maybe it was seeing the divisions in his own state up close. Or maybe, and I think this is closer to the truth, maybe he just decided that honesty mattered more than party loyalty. Because Pennsylvania is a unique place. It's not solidly blue or red. It's purple. It's got cities that vote one way and rural areas that vote another. And Fetterman grew up in that conservative part of Pennsylvania. He knows those people. He loves those people. They're his family, his neighbors, his friends. And when his party started calling those same people Nazis and fascists and deplorables, something broke inside him. And then came the day that changed everything live, on stage. Picture this. A packed auditorium at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. News Nation is hosting a town hall. The lights are bright. The crowd is waiting. And out walks John Fetterman, along with political commentator Bill O'Reilly. Now, O'Reilly isn't exactly known for softballs. He's direct, sometimes confrontational, but always gets to the point. And the point he wanted to make that night was simple. John, why are you still a Democrat? It's a fair question, really, because if you look at Fetterman's positions, his strong support for Israel, his backing of Ukraine, his refusal to go along with endless government spending, his calls for fiscal responsibility, he doesn't sound like most Democrats in Washington these days. So O'Reilly asked him directly, and Fetterman's answer? It wasn't what anyone expected. He said, "Look, I'm the only Democrat in my family. I grew up surrounded by conservatives. I know people who voted for Trump not once, but twice. And they're not fascists. They're not Nazis. They're not trying to destroy the Constitution. They're just Americans with different views. And I refuse to call them names. I refuse to compare anyone to Hitler. Because that kind of extreme rhetoric, that leads to violence. That tears the country apart." Think about that for a second. Here's a sitting U.S. senator live on national television telling his own party and the entire country that the way Democrats talk about Republicans is dangerous. Not just wrong, not just unfair, dangerous. He said it plainly. If we keep calling people Nazis, if we keep saying they're a threat to democracy, we're making political violence more likely. And he knows that firsthand. Because Fetterman is from Pennsylvania. He's from the same state where, just last year, Donald Trump was shot in the face at a rally in Butler. A bullet grazed Trump's ear. A father in the crowd was killed. And Fetterman hasn't forgotten that. Even if the rest of his party seems to have moved on. He stood there on that stage and said, "We need to lower the temperature. We need to disagree without calling each other enemies. We need to remember we're all Americans. And you know what? The audience applauded. They clapped, because what he said made sense. It was common sense. The kind of wisdom your grandparents would have called basic decency. But in Washington, common sense gets you in trouble. In one sentence, Fetterman shattered years of party rhetoric, and the backlash was instant. Within hours, the news cycle turned on him. Progressive commentators on social media called him a traitor. Some said he was kissing Trump's ring. Others accused him of abandoning the values he was elected to uphold. Democratic operatives in Pennsylvania started whispering about primary challenges in future elections. They weren't even subtle about it. Reports came out saying party insiders were already looking for someone to run against him when his term ends. Because apparently, in the modern Democratic Party, telling people not to call their neighbors Nazis is a fireable offense. The irony here is almost poetic. The party that prides itself on tolerance and inclusion can't tolerate one of their own senators speaking his mind. The party that claims to defend free speech is now trying to silence a man for exercising it. And the party that says it represents working people is rejecting the one senator who actually talks like a working person and defends their values. You'd think telling people not to call half the country Nazis would be common sense, not career suicide. But here we are. And Fetterman? He didn't back down. In fact, he doubled down. Because the town hall wasn't the only place he broke ranks. Just days before that event, Fetterman publicly blamed Chuck Schumer and Senate Democrats for the ongoing government shutdown. Now, for context, government shutdowns happen when Congress can't agree on a budget. They're messy, they're disruptive, and both sides usually point fingers at each other. But what's rare, extremely rare, is for a member of one party to openly say, "Yeah, this is our fault. My party is the problem here." That's what Fetterman did. He said Democrats were playing games, refusing to negotiate, and putting politics over people. He called it out by name. And that's not something you do in Washington unless you're willing to pay the price. And when you combine that with what happened in Chicago courtrooms the same week, you start to see a pattern. Because while Fetterman was telling his party to stop being so divisive and hypocritical, a Democratic judge in Cook County, Illinois, was doing the exact opposite, issuing a ruling so extreme it made headlines across the country. Here's what happened. Judge Timothy Evans, the chief judge of the Cook County Circuit Court, signed an order banning immigration and customs enforcement agents from making arrests inside courthouses. The reasoning? He said people were afraid to come to court because they might get detained by immigration authorities. He argued that this fear was disrupting the justice system, making witnesses and defendants skip their court dates, and creating what he called an unsafe environment. Now, on the surface, that might sound reasonable. Nobody wants people too scared to show up for court, right? But let's think this through. We're talking about individuals who are in the country illegally and in many cases have been arrested for crimes, some of them serious crimes, and instead of handing them over to federal immigration authorities who have a legal mandate to enforce immigration law, this judge decided courthouses should become sanctuary zones, safe spaces where the law doesn't fully apply. The response from law enforcement was immediate. ICE officials said this ruling ties their hands. They explained that when local authorities refuse to cooperate when they release criminal suspects back onto the streets, instead of transferring them to federal custody, ICE has no choice but to go into neighborhoods to find those individuals. And that's more dangerous for everyone, for the agents, for the communities, and yes, even for the individuals being arrested. Because an arrest in a controlled courthouse is a lot safer than a high-speed chase or a confrontation on a residential street. So, what does this ruling really tell us about the current direction of leadership? It tells us that ideology is overriding common sense. It tells us that political signaling, looking compassionate, sounding progressive, has become more important than actual public safety. And it tells us that there's a growing disconnect between what everyday Americans want and what their leaders are willing to do. Think about it this way. Imagine you're a parent living in Cook County. Your neighborhood has seen an uptick in crime. You hear stories on the news about repeat offenders being released without consequences. And now you learn that a judge has made it harder for federal agents to arrest people who shouldn't even be in the country to begin with, and some of whom have committed violent crimes? How does that make you feel? Safe? Protected? Or abandoned? This is what Fetterman was talking about on that stage. When you prioritize narrative over reality, when you let emotions dictate policy instead of logic and evidence, systems start to break down. And that breakdown doesn't ask if you're left or right, it just happens. It affects everyone. And Fetterman, surprisingly, seems to understand that better than most in his party. He gets that you can't just ignore the concerns of people who feel unsafe. You can't dismiss them as bigots or racists just because they want secure borders and enforced laws. You can't keep pretending that everything is fine when people can see with their own eyes that it's not. That's why his comments about President Trump's policies hit so hard. During the town hall, Fetterman was asked whether he thought Kamala Harris could have achieved the same peace deals Trump brokered in the Middle East. His answer? No. He said it outright. He praised Trump for getting hostages released, for negotiating deals that others couldn't. He said Trump deserves credit for that. And again, can you imagine the political courage that takes? To be a Democrat in front of a national audience and say, yeah, the Republican president did something good, something I couldn't do, something my party's candidate couldn't have done either. But every time he tells the truth, his own allies treat him like a traitor. Because in modern politics, loyalty to the party line is valued more than honesty, more than integrity, more than doing what's right. And that's a problem, a serious problem. Because when a political party becomes more like a cult, where dissent is punished and independent thought is banned, it's not really a political party anymore. It's a machine. And machines don't care about people, they care about power. And yet, instead of learning from Fetterman, instead of listening to what he's saying and maybe, just maybe, considering that he has a point, the Democratic establishment has decided to erase him, to sideline him, to prepare for his political execution in a few years when his seat comes up for re-election, because that's easier than admitting they might be wrong. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because while all this was unfolding, while Fetterman was speaking truth and getting punished for it, while the Chicago judge was making his controversial ruling, the media was working overtime to control the narrative. And that tells you everything you need to know about where we are as a country right now. Let me give you an example. CNN, one of the major news networks, covered the story about ICE agents facing threats. Federal authorities announced that Mexican cartels had placed bounties on the heads of ICE officers, actual bounties, offering money to anyone who would harm or kill these agents. The Department of Homeland Security called it credible intelligence. They said criminal networks were working with domestic extremist groups to target federal law enforcement. This is serious stuff. Life and death serious. But watch how CNN reported it. Their correspondent stood there and said, essentially, well, the government claims this is happening, but we haven't seen the specific evidence. We're still looking for more details. The tone was skeptical, doubtful, as if federal authorities were just making things up. And then, to really drive the point home, the reporter brought up a previous case where he said, the initial press release from immigration officials mentioned a weapon that later wasn't included in the formal charges. The implication? Don't trust what the government is telling you about threats to ICE agents. Now, think about that for a moment. When it's a story that makes the Trump administration or immigration enforcement look good, or at least sympathetic, suddenly journalists become skeptical. They demand proof. They question motives. They dig for inconsistencies. But when it's a story that fits the narrative they prefer, the one where immigration enforcement is the villain, no skepticism, no questioning, just straight reporting or even amplification. This is what we call narrative management. It's not journalism in the traditional sense where you report facts and let people decide. It's journalism as activism, where the goal is to shape how people think and feel about an issue. And it's everywhere now. It's not unique to CNN. You see it across major networks, newspapers, and online platforms. The story gets filtered through a political lens before it reaches you. And if it doesn't fit the lens, it gets downplayed, questioned, or ignored entirely. That's why Fetterman's words resonated so powerfully. because he wasn't filtering, he wasn't spinning, he was just saying what he believed, in plain language, without worrying about whether it would sound good on MSNBC or get him trending on social media. And people responded to that. Not just Republicans, though. They certainly appreciated it, but independents, moderates, and even some Democrats who are tired of being told what they're supposed to think. Because here's the truth. Most Americans don't live in the extremes. They don't spend their days obsessing over politics or picking teams like it's a sports league. They just want things to work. They want safe neighborhoods. They want a government that functions. They want leaders who tell the truth and treat them with respect, even when they disagree. And when someone like Fetterman comes along and actually does that, it stands out, it feels refreshing, and it makes you wonder why more people don't do it. The answer, of course, is fear. Fear of losing power, fear of being ostracized, fear of the mob, whether that mob is on Twitter, in the media, or inside your own party. But when the media filters reality, people turn elsewhere for answers. And that's why Fetterman's words resonated far beyond his own state. He tapped into something deeper, a hunger for authenticity, for honesty, for leaders who act like human beings instead of programmed robots. So what does Fetterman represent now? He's become a symbol, not intentionally maybe, but a symbol nonetheless. He represents a growing number of people who are disillusioned with where their party has gone. Democrats who remember when their party stood for the working class, for free speech, for questioning authority. People who feel like the party left them, not the other way around. And there are millions of them out there, voters who don't fit neatly into the new progressive mold, but who aren't ready to become Republicans either. They're politically homeless, and Fetterman is speaking directly to them. But he also represents something bigger. He represents what happens when a political movement becomes so rigid, so ideologically pure, that it can't tolerate dissent. History teaches us this lesson over and over again. Parties that punish honesty don't last. Movements that demand conformity eventually collapse under their own weight. Because innovation, whether in technology, business, or politics, requires friction. It requires debate. It requires people who are willing to say, wait, I think we're getting this wrong. In any system, censorship and conformity kill progress. If everyone just nods along and repeats the same talking points, nothing improves, nothing evolves. You end up with stagnation. And eventually, the whole thing breaks down. That's true in science, in engineering, in business, and it's especially true in politics. When you create an environment where telling the truth gets you punished, you're not building a strong organization, you're building a house of cards. And right now, the Democratic Party looks like a house of cards. You've got Fetterman on one side telling uncomfortable truths. You've got a judge in Chicago making rulings that even some Democrats privately think go too far. You've got polls showing the party's approval ratings sinking, especially among the working class voters they used to count on. You've got younger progressives demanding one thing and older moderates demanding another. And in the middle of it all, you've got leadership that seems frozen, unable or unwilling to make the hard choices necessary to pull things together. And yet, instead of learning from him, instead of taking Fetterman's honesty as a warning sign, the establishment decided to erase him. Party operatives are already laying the groundwork for a primary challenge when his seat comes up for re-election. They're looking for someone who will stay on message, someone who won't cause trouble, someone who will vote the way they're told and say the things they're supposed to say, because that's what the machine wants, obedience. But here's the problem with that strategy. Voters are paying attention, and they don't like what they see. According to recent polling, Fetterman's approval rating among Pennsylvania Democrats has dropped significantly from around 80% down to the low 30s. That sounds bad, right? But here's the twist. His approval among Republicans in Pennsylvania has skyrocketed. It's now over 60%. Think about that. A Democratic senator is more popular with Republicans than with his own party. What does that tell you? It tells you that the political ground is shifting. The old labels, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, they're starting to mean less than they used to. People aren't asking, what party are you? They're asking, do you tell the truth? Do you stand up for what you believe? Do you treat people with respect, even when you disagree? And if the answer is yes, they'll support you regardless of the letter next to your name. This is the beginning of something. Maybe a political realignment, maybe a new movement, maybe just a growing frustration with the status quo that eventually forces both parties to change. But whatever it is, it's real, and it's not going away. Because at the same time Fetterman was speaking truth, the system he's part of was busy proving his point. The Chicago courthouse ruling is a perfect example. It's the kind of decision that sounds compassionate on the surface. We're protecting vulnerable people from being afraid, but in practice creates real problems. It makes communities less safe. It makes law enforcement's job harder, and it sends a message that laws are optional, that they only apply when it's convenient, when it fits the right narrative. And here's the thing, most Americans don't want that. They don't want lawlessness. They don't want chaos. They want order, fairness, and accountability. They want a system that works for everyone, not just the people who shout the loudest or have the right political connections. And when they see leaders making decisions that undermine that system, whether it's a judge banning ICE arrests or politicians refusing to negotiate in good faith during a government shutdown, they lose faith, not just in those specific leaders, but in the entire process. So, what comes next? That's the question on everyone's mind. We're still a few years away from the next major election cycle, but the groundwork is being laid right now. And if the internal fractures we're seeing in the Democratic Party continue to widen, we could be looking at a political landscape that's very different from anything we've seen in recent decades. You've got centrist Democrats who feel abandoned by their party's move to the left. You've got independents who are tired of the extremes on both sides. You've got working class voters, many of them union members, people who used to be the backbone of the Democratic coalition, who now feel more at home with Republicans because at least Republicans acknowledge their concerns about job safety and border security. And you've got people like Fetterman, who don't fit neatly into any category, who are carving out their own path and attracting support from unexpected places. Some political analysts are already talking about 2028 as a potential turning point. If the Democrats continue down their current path, doubling down on ideological purity, punishing dissenters, prioritizing identity politics over kitchen table issues, they risk losing not just swing states like Pennsylvania, but even traditionally blue states, where voters are getting fed up. And if that happens, you could see the rise of new coalitions, new movements, new parties even, or at the very least, a redefinition of what it means to be a Democrat or a Republican. Is this the beginning of a new political realignment, where honesty finally outweighs party loyalty? Maybe. It's too early to say for sure, but the signs are there. The cracks are visible. And people like Fetterman are showing that there's an appetite for something different, for something real. Let me bring this home with a bigger truth. We are watching two parallel collapses playing out in real time. One is political, the collapse of a party that has lost touch with the people it claims to represent. The other is moral, the collapse of a shared understanding that truth matters, that honesty should be rewarded, that we can disagree without destroying each other. And both of those collapses are connected. Because when politics becomes about power instead of principle, when winning becomes more important than being right, the moral foundation crumbles. And once that foundation is gone, everything else falls apart. But here's the thing. It doesn't have to be that way. Collapses can be stopped, systems can be rebuilt, but it requires people to speak up, to tell the truth, even when it's hard, to stand up for what's right, even when it costs them something. That's what Fetterman did. And whether you agree with him on every issue or not, you have to respect the courage it takes to do that. This is why your voice still matters, because truth only survives when people keep speaking it even when it's unpopular, even when it gets you in trouble, even when your own friends and allies turn on you. The moment we stop speaking the truth, the moment we start going along just to get along, that's when the system wins. That's when the machine takes over. And that's when we lose the very thing that makes us human, our ability to think for ourselves, to question, to challenge, to grow. You've lived through a lot. You've seen administrations come and go. You've watched the country change in ways both good and bad. And you know from experience that nothing lasts forever. Parties rise and fall, leaders come and go, but the principles, honesty, integrity, courage, decency, those are timeless, and those are worth fighting for. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this. First, don't be fooled by labels. Democrat, Republican, progressive, conservative, those words matter less than the character of the person behind them. Judge people by what they do, not what they say they are. Second, don't be afraid to speak the truth. Even if it's unpopular, even if people disagree, your voice matters more than you think. And third, pay attention. Don't just consume the headlines. Dig deeper, ask questions, think for yourself. Because the system, whether it's the media, the political parties, or the special interests, they're counting on you not to. Fetterman's story is a reminder that one person can make a difference, that honesty can break through the noise, that courage can inspire others, but it's also a warning that the forces that want to silence dissent, that want to enforce conformity, that want to punish truth-tellers, they're real, and they're powerful, and they won't stop unless we stop them. If you believe honesty shouldn't be punished, and that every American deserves the truth, no matter which side it comes from, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who still believes in common sense, and subscribe. Because the next story we cover might just change everything we thought we knew. The world is changing, and the only way to make sense of it all is to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay true to what you know is right. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for caring enough to seek out the truth in a world that often tries to hide it.